slow aerial shot over Chicago's south side, fog creeping between ancient brick tenements. The camera cuts to a damp alleyway in New York's Little Italy, where the ghost of laughter seems to echo between crumbling walls. What if I told you that beneath the bustling streets of Chicago and the glittering skyline of New York, something ancient and restless still prowls? That the old legends whispered in immigrant tongues never truly died, but instead found new ways to haunt these American streets? In Chicago, they say you can still hear the hollow wails of Polish mothers searching for their lost children. In New York, certain dimly lit bars keep a chair empty at midnight, just in case old Mafia souls decide to drop by for a final drink. Tonight, we're going to journey into these shadowed alleys and forgotten basements, unearthing two of America's most chilling urban spirits: Chicago's Immigrant Hauntings versus New York's Mafia ghosts. By the end, you might just question if the past ever really stays buried. Historical and cultural context: sensory, rich, immersive. The immigrant echoes of Chicago. The story begins in the late 1800s. Chicago was a city of flame and steel, still clawing its way back from the Great Fire of 1871. Newly arrived immigrants, Poles, Lithuanians, Italians, Irish, poured in by the thousands, their calloused hands eager for the back-breaking promise of factory work. Imagine walking down Maxwell Street in 1895, the sharp scent of pickled herring mixing with acrid coal smoke. Vendors shouted in Polish, German, Yiddish. Children in threadbare coats darted between horse carts, chasing battered leather balls. But just beyond this vibrant chaos lay the slaughterhouses of the Union stockyards, a labyrinth of blood-soaked floors, echoing with the terrified squeals of pigs and cattle. Many immigrants worked here, losing fingers, hands, sometimes even their lives. Local priests recorded unusually high rates of suicides among young women. Girls who had come alone, promised work, only to find themselves prey to foremen and pimps. Even today, the descendants of these families whisper about the Gray Maidens, somber figures in soot-streaked dresses who appear in stairwells of old tenements, weeping into their aprons. They're said to carry the smell of iron and something faintly floral, like a funeral wreath. Now picture New York in 1922. Jazz bands blare through thin apartment walls in Hell's Kitchen. But down in Little Italy, under strings of glowing lanterns, whispers travel faster than light. The Mafia families, Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, ran these streets like shadow governments. Backroom deals settled with nods over espresso. Murders ordered with a simple tug at a cufflink. Barrels of bootleg whiskey rolled through secret tunnels under Mulberry Street. Some say these same tunnels became tombs. A careless associate might be invited down to inspect the shipment, never to see daylight again. Elderly shopkeepers claim that on certain humid nights, they still see sharp-dressed men from another era, fedoras pulled low, lingering by lampposts. Cigarette tips glow, then vanish. The air fills with an abrupt chill, heavy as velvet. In 1978, a Chicago housing inspector named Raymond Crouchick was sent to assess complaints about faulty heating in an abandoned 3-flat on West 18th Street. According to his handwritten report, still filed in the city's dusty archives, he heard distinct sobbing, as of a woman bereaved, coming from the 3rd floor. He climbed the narrow staircase, flashlight beam shaking over water-stained wallpaper. When he reached the landing, he swore he saw the imprint of a woman's hand on the fogged window. 5 perfect fingers, even though the outside air was below freezing. When he turned to leave, he caught a faint whiff of lilacs, totally out of place in that mildew-choked building. Meanwhile, in Manhattan, bartender stories swirl around the Bent Elbow, a speakeasy-turned-dive bar that stood near Mott Street since 1910. Marco Ferrucci, the current owner, has told local tour groups that every few weeks, just after last call, a bar stool nearest the old brick wall will scrape back on its own. Sometimes patrons even hear the soft clink of glass on wood, like someone toasting to secrets long kept. One drunk college kid who tried to sit in the Phantom's chair claimed he felt an ice-cold hand grip his shoulder. He ran out shrieking, leaving his friends laughing, until they noticed 4 bruised fingerprints the next morning. These hauntings don't just linger in folklore. They've slithered right into our pop culture veins. Chicago's haunted immigrant past inspired entire arcs in shows like Lovecraft Country and American Horror Story. Hotel, where ghostly figures dressed in 19th century immigrant garb drift through modern corridors. In New York, countless Mafia films, The Godfather, Goodfellas, even The Sopranos, dance along the edge of the supernatural. Directors have admitted in interviews that they filmed certain scenes on old Mafia blocks hoping to capture the spirits of real wise guys. And of course, there's the booming dark tourism industry. Every October, tour buses snake through Chicago's Bridgeport neighborhood, guides spinning tales of immigrant suicides and spectral processions. In New York, ghost walks down Mulberry Street promise sightings of mobsters still enforcing omerta from beyond the grave. So what do we make of it? Are these just echoes of history? Psychological projections of collective guilt and grief? Or is there truly something still stalking these streets, drawn by old debts and broken hearts? We'll peel back even darker layers, examining secret diaries uncovered in a Chicago convent that hint at demonic bargains, and mysterious ledgers from New York's Mafia vaults listing names of people who vanished without a trace. But before we move on, I want to know what you think. Have you ever visited Chicago or New York and felt a strange shiver, like someone was watching you from just out of sight? Or maybe your family carries stories passed down from immigrant grandparents or great uncles who saw things they wouldn't talk about. Drop your experiences or theories in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this eerie dive into forgotten American hauntings, consider subscribing, not just to this channel, but to our ongoing journey through the strangest shadows of history. It begins with the brittle pages of a journal found behind a loose stone in the basement of St. Casimir's, an old Polish convent on Chicago's South Side. The building was slated for demolition in 1993, long after the last nuns had fled the crumbling halls. A construction worker named Luis Herrera was assigned to dismantle the foundation. When his crowbar dislodged a chunk of mortar, a small leather-bound book tumbled out, spewing dust and an almost sweet coppery odor. Luis would later say that smell haunted him for weeks, clinging to his hands no matter how hard he scrubbed. The journal, written in looping, terrified Polish, belonged to Sister Agnieszka Kroll. Her entries from 1912 to 1914 detailed dreams of a faceless man who appeared at the convent gates after Vespers, promising to protect the sisters from cholera that was ravaging the slums, if only they would offer the song of their blood in return. At first it seemed mad, but then cholera bypassed their street entirely, even as mass graves filled blocks away. By the spring of 1913, Sister Agnieszka wrote of children's laughter echoing in the empty hallways at night. Once she found tiny handprints in ash near the altar. Another sister reportedly awoke to find her rosary twisted tight around her neck, beads cracking like tiny vertebrae. The final entry was simply a splatter of ink, the nib torn through the page as though by a violent jerk. When local historians tried to carbon date the book's cover, the leather registered as human skin. Meanwhile, across the country, another ledger surfaced in a Queen's estate sale in 2008. Its cover was stamped with an insignia thought long lost to New York's Mafia lore, a delicate Ouroboros encircling the words, "Family is forever." Each page listed names and dates, but instead of financial transactions or shipments of bootleg spirits, the columns bore cryptic notations like "Voice silenced, 12:04:23, and dull eyes, 07:11:25. Eyes dimmed, voices silenced." Nearly every name corresponded with an unresolved missing persons case in New York archives. There was one chilling deviation. Near the end of the ledger, a short paragraph in meticulous Italian read, "Do not bury the unfaithful on blessed ground. The night does not hold them. They walk, they knock, they wait for the door to open." This small passage reawakened a series of half-forgotten stories among older Italian families. Maria Vitale, who ran a bakery on Arthur Avenue, swore her grandfather kept a candle burning in the window every night, not for the saints, but to keep the Capodicina who betrayed the code from tapping on their shutters. As a child, she remembered being ordered away from the windows after dark. Even now, she claims that if she stays too late at the shop, she sometimes hears soft knuckles rapping on the glass, followed by a whisper so low it feels like it's breathed directly into her ear. Back in Chicago, more evidence of old bargains began to surface. A team of renovators working on a historical brownstone near Pilsen discovered a series of shallow, brick-lined pits beneath the cellar floor. Inside each lay what appeared to be scraps of burial garments, a child's shoe, a woman's bonnet, all soaked dark with age. The local medical examiner, called in by sheer procedural necessity, could find no intact remains, only black, waxy stains in the soil that tested positive for hemoglobin. A folklorist from the University of Illinois compiled dozens of oral histories from descendants of Lithuanian and Bohemian immigrants who once packed that neighborhood. Over and over, the same phrase surfaced. The price was agreed to long ago, but no one could say exactly what that price entailed, or who, if anyone, still comes to collect. What makes all of this more unsettling is how the lines blur between history and current events. In 2017, a Chicago paramedic named Daniel Rojas responded to a routine welfare check in an aging apartment building on West 21st Place. An elderly tenant hadn't been seen for days. When they forced the door, the smell was immediate, an unholy fusion of rot and floral air freshener. They found the woman's body seated at her kitchen table, eyes wide open, mouth fixed in a grotesque half-smile. On the table before her was a chipped porcelain plate holding 2 withered lilac blooms. Daniel would later confide to colleagues that before they zipped the body bag, he distinctly heard a voice whisper in Polish, right behind his shoulder, though the apartment was otherwise empty. New York's Mafia ghosts don't confine themselves to dimly lit bars or quaint ghost tours either. A security guard at a private parking garage on Broome Street reported multiple incidents where the CCTV footage showed a man in a long dark overcoat wandering among the parked BMWs and Teslas. This wouldn't be notable except for one detail. He always appeared only on the cameras, never in person, and he cast no discernible shadow. On 2 occasions, car alarms blared simultaneously the moment he passed, lights flashing wildly before falling silent in unison as soon as he was gone. A retired NYPD detective named Salvatore Greco, who served from 1974 to 1999, claims the department had an unofficial understanding to avoid certain basements during organized crime raids. He recounted one particular operation in 1986, targeting a suspected Lucchese safe house in the Bronx. When they descended the narrow steps, flashlights caught on rows of old wooden chairs arranged in a perfect circle. At the center stood a table with an empty wine bottle and 3 glasses, each half filled with what appeared to be dark red liquid. Greco admits he felt a sudden pressure on his chest, like being squeezed by invisible hands. Without exchanging a word, every officer backed up the stairs and radioed in a false report, claiming the building was clear. The deeper you dig, the clearer it becomes that these stories refuse to die. They mutate, crawl through new generations, adapt to modern fears. College students renting cheap apartments in Chicago's back of the yards district talk about waking to find tiny, muddy footprints leading from their bedroom door to the edge of their bed. New parents hear lullabies sung in languages they don't recognize over baby monitors. In New York, rideshare drivers compare notes about odd passengers, men who smell of expensive cologne and stale cigars, give curt directions to dead-end alleys, and simply vanish from the back seat when the driver turns to confirm drop-off. Social media fans the flames. A viral TikTok last year showed a group of young women exploring an abandoned Union Hall on Chicago's southwest side. As the camera panned over peeling murals of saints and stockyard workers, a gaunt face appeared at the edge of the frame, pale, with hollow eyes that seemed impossibly deep. The clip cut off in static. For weeks afterward, commenters claimed to see the same face in reflections on their own phones. Meanwhile, an influencer in Brooklyn live-streamed a late-night walk through Knickerbocker Avenue, playfully recounting mob hits from the 1970s. When he paused under a broken street lamp to check his comments, viewers flooded the chat, insisting they could see a tall figure standing just behind him, hand on his shoulder. The influencer laughed it off until his next video, where he sported heavy bruising across his collarbone that he couldn't explain. What's perhaps most chilling is how these tales seep into seemingly innocuous aspects of urban life. In Chicago, real estate agents quietly warn prospective buyers that certain vintage properties have unusual energy, a euphemism that does little to prevent price drops when rumors swirl of previous tenants waking with bloodied feet or finding strands of long black hair coiled around doorknobs. In New York, upscale restaurants built over old Mafia hangouts sometimes keep a table permanently reserved, set with fresh bread and a small carafe of wine, out of a tradition they joke about but never break. Waitstaff swear that failing to prepare this offering brings sudden leaks, shattered glassware, even inexplicable kitchen fires. So where does all this leave us? Are these lingering souls simply fragments of cultural memory? Immigrant anguish and mafia violence so intense they imprinted on brick and bone? Or is there a darker force at play? Something that feasts on grief and loyalty, drawing sustenance from unkept promises and unpaid debts. In the next block, we'll push even further into this abyss, tracking down a modern priest in Chicago who claims his parish is haunted not by ghosts, but by the sins of an entire community, and a New York psychic who says the Mafia's dead are organizing for something that's yet to come. Their testimonies might finally crack open what's truly lurking in the hidden arteries of these cities. But before we press on, take a breath and think carefully. Have you ever walked down an alley in Chicago or passed under a lamppost in New York and felt your skin tighten, convinced for just a second that someone was following? Maybe there was no one there when you turned, or maybe you simply couldn't see them. Tell me your theories. Share any strange family stories that have survived in whispered fragments. And if this dark journey into America's haunted underbelly is gripping you, stay with us. The next revelations might just make you question what's standing behind you right now. The story shifts now to a man who never expected to be drawn into the dark arteries of Chicago's hidden past. Father Matthew Driscoll arrived from Des Moines in 2015, assigned to revive dwindling attendance at St. Stanislaus Kostka, a magnificent but crumbling church nestled in the heart of an old Polish enclave. From the outside, it looked like something out of a European Gothic painting. Towering spires, stone angels whose faces had eroded into almost leering masks. By day, the church offered sunlight streaming through stained glass, a scent of beeswax and aging wood. But by night, it became a different entity altogether. Father Driscoll had served in parishes across Iowa without incident, performing last rites and consoling grieving families without once questioning the thin veil between the living and the dead. Chicago changed that within weeks. He noticed it first in confessions. Elderly parishioners would whisper sins that sounded less like personal failings and more like curses echoing down bloodlines. One woman sobbed that she still left fresh bread at her doorstep every Friday night so he wouldn't come scratching at the window. When pressed on who he was, she merely shuddered and crossed herself so violently her rosary snapped. The strangest event came on a cold November evening. Driscoll had finished locking up after a sparse evening mass when he heard a faint scratching from the vestibule. Assuming it was a rat, he approached, only to see a small boy standing by the font. The child's clothes were oddly dated. Short wool pants, a white shirt with tiny mother-of-pearl buttons, and his skin was a sickly gray that seemed to drink in the dim light. Before the priest could utter a word, the boy placed a hand on the font's edge. Instantly, the holy water darkened, swirling with what looked like thick black threads. Then the boy smiled, revealing teeth that were far too sharp, and simply disappeared. Driscoll found himself alone, gripping his chest, mouth flooded with the metallic tang of blood. The next morning, maintenance found dead birds arranged in a perfect circle outside the main doors. Meanwhile, nearly 800 miles east, a woman named Rosa Santini was making waves in Brooklyn's underbelly. Officially, she ran a boutique that sold imported Italian soaps and lace. Unofficially, she was the psychic confidant to aging mobsters who still clung to old codes, even as their empires crumbled under federal indictments and internal decay. Rosa claimed she could speak to the capos who had crossed over, men who died with secrets clenched in cold fists, secrets they weren't ready to relinquish. Rosa's sessions were infamous. Clients would gather in the candle-lit back room of her shop, seated around a marble table so old its surface was etched with names nobody recognized. Incense thickened the air to a suffocating perfume of frankincense and something bitter that clung to the tongue. Rosa would place her hands flat, close her eyes, and begin murmuring in a blend of Sicilian dialect and Latin. Sometimes she would let out a strangled gasp, then relay messages that made grown men turn pale. Once, she reportedly warned a mid-level associate that his brother was plotting to kill him, describing the precise corner in Queens where it would happen. The man ignored her. 2 weeks later, he was found shot twice behind the ear, exactly where Rosa had described. But Rosa's revelations weren't confined to petty vendettas. During one particularly intense session in 2019, she opened her eyes mid-trance and spoke with a voice not her own. It was deeper, older, each syllable scraping against the walls as if clawed from the inside. She declared that the dead were gathering, organizing in their silent ranks, because something was awakening that would require every debt ever owed to be paid, down to the last whisper. the last drop of spilled blood. One of the men at the table tried to laugh it off, but Rosa's pupils rolled back, and she began to weep thick tears that left rusty stains on her cheeks. She collapsed moments later, her heartbeat erratic for hours. She never offered another seance of that magnitude again. These stories might sound like theatrical folklore, perfect for spicing up tours or feeding the endless appetite of online horror channels. But their persistence, across time, across communities who rarely share myths, suggests something festering beneath the surface of these American cities that's more than simple coincidence. Take, for example, the cluster of unexplained disappearances linked to former Mafia safe houses in New York. Even after these buildings were converted into luxury lofts, the pattern didn't stop. Between 2015 and 2022, 7 individuals vanished within a 2-block radius of a former Genovese stronghold on Mott Street. Police reports cite no clear evidence of foul play, no signs of forced entry or struggle. Yet neighbors repeatedly report seeing the missing persons on evenings after they were supposedly last alive, standing in shadowed doorways, staring blankly at passing cars before slipping out of sight. In Chicago, a parallel unease infects blocks that once housed boarding houses for slaughterhouse workers. Residents complain of insomnia punctuated by vivid nightmares of shadowy figures dragging burlap sacks that leave dark, wet trails. Dogs refuse to enter certain basements, bristling and whimpering at thresholds. Plumbers have recounted finding old cisterns brimming not with water but with a viscous dark sludge that inexplicably vanishes after exposure to light. Modern science tries to write these phenomena off as mass hysteria, urban stress responses, the psychological inheritance of ancestral trauma. Maybe there's truth in that, but it fails to explain the physical traces, the handprints that appear on cold windows from the outside, the footprints of children embedded in concrete sidewalks where no child ever walked. The sudden power surges that fry brand new security systems in buildings tied to old debts and darker promises. Digital age folklore only accelerates the infection. Reddit is saturated with first-hand accounts from gig workers, rideshare drivers who pick up silent passengers in 1920s suits, only to watch them dissolve into the back seat like mist when they reach an intersection that once hosted a mob shooting. Delivery cyclists in Chicago swear they've glimpsed spectral processions moving down alleys at twilight. Entire families in turn-of-the-century garb holding hands, faces twisted in silent mourning. By the time the cyclists circle back to take another look, the alley stands empty, though the air remains inexplicably colder, as if those figures siphoned the heat straight from the bricks. Even law enforcement can't completely dismiss the undercurrent. A retired Chicago detective who requested anonymity admitted to an incident in 2004 when his team investigated repeated reports of screams from a vacant lot where a tenement burned down in 1918. They arrived to find no people, just rows of blackened earth as if something had recently been scorched. Their radio communications cut out simultaneously, replaced by faint weeping and what sounded disturbingly like prayers recited in broken Polish. When the radios came back, the timestamp had jumped ahead by 43 minutes, though none of them recalled any lapse in consciousness. So is it mere legend? Or is there an intelligence at work, an orchestrated haunting rooted in old bargains? Rosa Santini once cryptically suggested that the Mafia's afterlife isn't scattered souls wandering aimlessly. She claimed there was structure, a hierarchy that persisted beyond the grave, with codes and vendettas enforced by those who no longer fear mortal consequences. Her warnings dovetail with Father Driscoll's reluctant conclusions in Chicago. After nearly a decade serving St. Stanislaus, he's amassed a private collection of parishioner confessions that chart patterns of mysterious illnesses, sudden windfalls followed by catastrophic accidents, and children born with inexplicable birthmarks matching wounds of ancestors long dead. Both cities thus reveal themselves not simply as haunted locales, but as ecosystems feeding off cycles of guilt, violence, and desperate attempts to bargain with forces no living human truly understands. They're laboratories of the supernatural, incubating stories that mutate and intensify with each generation. This fusion of immigrant suffering in Chicago and mafia retribution in New York weaves a national mythology darker than any European fairy tale. Because its monsters aren't wolves in the forest or witches in cabins, they're your own bloodlines, the debts your great-grandparents etched in sweat and secrecy. We'll journey deeper still, tracing fresh footprints left by the past into modern subcultures. How Chicago's underground rave scene flirts with these haunted sites, drawing energy from rumored ley lines beneath slaughterhouse ruins, and how Brooklyn's tattoo parlors have become confessional booths where Mafia descendants etch symbols onto skin as both tribute and ward against what still hunts them. We'll also confront startling new evidence, a series of psychiatric case files involving patients who claim to remember lives cut short by Mafia hits or factory accidents a century ago. Voices from beyond clawing to finish stories abruptly severed. Night in Chicago carries a texture most cities lack. It's not merely darkness, it's a living substance that seems to crawl along brick facades, slip under door frames, whisper through rusted fire escapes. Nowhere is this more palpable than in the after-hours pulse of the underground rave scene that has taken root in the city's forgotten industrial skeletons. Warehouses that once rang with the screams of livestock and the grinding teeth of machinery now vibrate with bass lines so deep they crack old mortar. But some claim the energy isn't purely the work of speakers and neon. Certain DJs boast quietly of booking spaces not for acoustics or space, but because they sit along lines of force that feed more than just human adrenaline. In a cavernous slaughterhouse ruin off South Halsted, where hooks still dangle from steel beams overhead, a series of clandestine parties have gained almost cult status. Flyers distributed on encrypted message boards promise contact beyond the veil. What draws hundreds of young people isn't merely the promise of thundering techno, but rumors that if the beat syncs just right with the building's long-cooled bloodlines, you'll catch glimpses of other dancers, figures moving out of step, faces strangely distorted, eyes reflecting light that isn't there. One woman described spinning under strobes, arms raised, only to see a child watching from atop a rusted conveyor belt, head cocked in unnatural curiosity. When the light swept back, he was gone, but the scent of burnt hair filled her nostrils until dawn. Simultaneously, a far different ritual unfolds in Brooklyn's gentrified labyrinth of tattoo parlors. These aren't mere sessions of body art for vanity or rebellion. They've become confessional chambers where descendants of Mafia bloodlines seek to inscribe protective sigils into their very skin. A rising demand exists for arcane symbols, ancient Mediterranean glyphs interwoven with modern designs, meant to confuse or repel spirits that might otherwise come to collect ancestral debts. One artist, known only as Lupo, described clients breaking into sobs mid-session, overcome not by pain but by visions that seemed to rush forward the moment the ink broke flesh. Lupo keeps a carefully locked drawer filled with napkins smeared with tears, sweat, and occasionally something darker, traces of crimson that emerge from nowhere, impossible to explain by any nick of the needle. Some dismiss these as psychological phenomena, the mind's desperate effort to process guilt handed down like heirlooms. But the consistency across so many unrelated people hints at something more structural, a trellis of dread that has wrapped itself through Chicago and New York alike. Psychiatrists have begun compiling unnervingly similar case files. In Chicago, Dr. Elena Kostyuk works at a small practice specializing in trauma among multi-generational immigrant families. Her notebooks bulge with accounts from patients who lapse into languages they never learned, recounting vivid memories of sweatshops, meatpacking lines, and sudden gory accidents. One woman awoke from a fugue with her hands raw, insistent she'd been trying to scrub blood from wooden floors that no longer exist. Meanwhile, in New York, Dr. Julian Messina found himself treating several young men who experienced identical night terrors, waking to see their bedroom doors swing open, revealing men in fedoras and dark overcoats whose eyes burned like coal, lips curling in a conspiratorial grin. The patient's descriptions converged on eerie specifics, right down to the scent of expensive cologne tainted by the sharp bite of gunpowder. Two of these patients, unconnected by family or neighborhood, later suffered inexplicable strokes that left them partially paralyzed, their last coherent statements insisting they had to pay it back before he comes. This notion of a bill coming due recurs like a heartbeat in every thread of these legends. It's almost as if the cities themselves operate on an old secret economy where human suffering serves as currency. Chicago's streets laid out atop forgotten rivers of slaughterhouse runoff, and New York's avenues, built over silent graves of those who crossed La Familia, echo with the idea that no debt, spiritual, emotional, or visceral, goes unpaid. This debt doesn't confine itself to the past. It leaks forward, infecting new lives who never asked to be part of these bargains. Even technology bends under the weight of these stories. Surveillance cameras fail in bizarre ways. In one Chicago condo complex, motion sensors installed for security instead became conduits of dread. Maintenance teams reported lights flickering to follow invisible paths through the hallways, as if someone dripping wet moved slowly from door to door. The building management replaced the system 3 times. Each new setup ended the same. Video files corrupted by streaks of black that sometimes almost looked like hands pressing against the lens. New York's financial district has its own unspoken boundaries. Traders at a boutique hedge fund occupying a former Mafia-owned building on Water Street reported elevators that ascended and descended of their own accord at precisely 3 a.m. nightly, doors opening to empty floors. Cleaning crews eventually refused to work after midnight, claiming the mirrored elevator interiors sometimes didn't reflect them, or worse, reflected someone standing beside them who vanished when they turned. Yet these modern hauntings also mutate to slip inside our contemporary obsessions. Social media, that vast electric confessional, is dotted with hashtags linking short, jittery phone videos of encounters. TikTok compilations gather clips of Chicago streets that flicker into grayscale for a few frames, of whispering picked up on baby monitors in old Little Italy apartments, of New Yorkers freezing on sidewalks because their AirPods pick up a second heartbeat layered over their music. These fragments feed a new folklore that spreads exponentially, no longer bound by neighborhood gossip but carried on algorithms that ensure even those far from Chicago or New York shiver with dread. It's easy to see how these phenomena root themselves in a culture already primed for ghost stories. But deeper down, there's something uniquely disturbing about the sense of agency attributed to these forces. Unlike typical hauntings where spirits are helpless echoes, trapped in repetition, Chicago's immigrant shadows and New York's mafia ghosts appear to choose, to organize, to wait patiently for the precise moment to act. Rosa Santini's claim of a structured afterlife within mafia ranks becomes less theatrical and more chilling in this light. Her final cryptic notes, found scribbled on scraps around her apartment after she vanished in 2021, suggest a coming event, a reunion where all old debts are settled under one moon. Father Driscoll, too, has shifted from private skepticism to grim acceptance. He now keeps a coded journal under lock and key, recording parish anomalies he refuses to disclose to church authorities. A leaked passage details a series of confessions from unrelated families, each describing the same apparition. A woman in a 19th century mourning dress, her veil lifted to reveal a mouth filled not with teeth, but with tiny writhing hands that beckon. She stands at the foot of beds, caresses sleeping foreheads, and whispers that their children will be safe only if the old promises are kept. Underneath all this grows a question that pulses with uncomfortable urgency. Who made these promises in the first place? Was it truly desperate immigrants and cornered mobsters? Or did something older merely cloak itself in the language and customs of suffering newcomers, using their grief and ambition as binding agents for ancient pacts? Such speculation seems dangerously close to paranoia, yet the patterns remain undeniable, visible not just in whispers, but in insurance statistics, health records, and the steady migration of urban legends from marginalized communities into mainstream consciousness. The stories you've heard so far, of shadowy boys by holy fonts, of mob ghosts raising glasses in empty bars, of whispered Polish lullabies in slaughterhouse shells, aren't isolated. They're filaments of a larger web stretching from Chicago's blood-soaked stockyards to New York's bullet-riddled backrooms, from candlelit seances in Brooklyn parlors to neon-drenched warehouse floors where sweat and something darker mingle. They reveal an America not scrubbed clean by modernity, but layered in ancient, restless bargains. Before we plunge into the next revelations, investigations of families who fled both cities only to find the same specters waiting for them in new towns, of DNA anomalies in descendants that might point to more than simple heredity, Pause for a moment and examine the faint tremor crawling up your spine. Ask yourself why these stories find such easy purchase in your imagination. Could it be because some fragment of your blood remembers its own unspoken agreements, struck long before you drew your first breath? This entire journey began with a simple question of who still lurks. The answer grows murkier the deeper we look, because it may not merely be ghosts, but entire family lines, entire communities still tethered by invisible chains to debts no living soul fully comprehends. Perhaps the reason these hauntings persist so vividly is because they're not stories at all. They're unfinished transactions. Now, before we continue to the next block, I want to turn directly to you. You've heard 4 blocks of this relentless tapestry, woven from whispered confessions, psychiatric files, ledger books inked in human dread. What do you think is truly at work here? Have you ever felt the echo of something watching, something waiting for you to take one more step into a shadow that doesn't quite belong to the surrounding light? Tell me in the comments below your theories, your family's quiet stories, the nightmares you're half convinced are